I'm Al McFarlane. Good afternoon. Welcome to a Friday session of Conversations with Al McFarlane. At this time every day, 7 days a week now through the end of the year, we've been connecting with people in community, in government, in agencies, in neighborhood organizations, in corporations, people in business, people in the neighborhood, talking about how we individually and collectively respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're pleased to have the support of the Minnesota Department of Health to underwrite this program, and today is a continuation of that. I'm here with my colleague, Brenda Lyle Gray, who is writing the series of stories that come out of these interviews. And today our guest is a dear friend, who has been with me before, Anastasia Belladonna Carrera. She's the executive director of Common Cause Minnesota. And we're going to talk about what Common Cause does and what's the Common Cause vision, work, posture in protecting, preserving our communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Anastasia is a lawyer and an activist in community. She is fierce. A lot of literature about her on internet, and she is just highly respected. A person who's known for speaking her mind. If there's no place at the table, she doesn't ask for it. She makes one for herself, and she makes one for others as well, because she believes that we have a right and a responsibility to be co-authors of futures in which our people win. So I'm pleased to see you again, Anastasia. Thank you for being here. And there we go.
Thank you, Al. It is a pleasure. And this is my favorite part of what I do with Common Cause. So I'm really looking forward to the next conversation.
Well, let's do Common Cause 101 again. Let's give people an idea of the scope, nature, purpose of the organization.
Thanks, Al. Sure. So Common Cause is a national organization with state offices in about 30 or so states across the country. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we take a lot of pride in that because we consider ourselves as watchdogs. If any of you have been tracking some of the elections issues, you've been seeing our names all over that, because whether it's in Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, you name it, and me in Minnesota, don't forget that. We always try to be at the forefront of making sure that it's ultimately communities, regardless of where you may be in that political spectrum, that are at the forefront of our democracy. One of the taglines that I love to say, it's something that I've kind of taken power and ownership over, is saying that we, the people, are the ultimate power of our democracy, and working from that focal point in everything that we do here in Minnesota. So again, my role as executive director is traditionally to make sure that the disenfranchised, particularly voters in Minnesota and communities in Minnesota, whether you're disenfranchised because of regional dynamics or you're disenfranchised because of race and ethnicity, I like to be one of those voices that bridges, right, government and how government works to communities, because I want communities and members, individuals, to be able to carve those spaces for themselves within these decisions of power that are going on, because we are the ones that hire them with our vote.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, in the area of COVID-19, what specifically is Common Cause Minnesota's role in advancing, protecting the interests of our people?
Well, when it comes to things like COVID-19, it's really as any other policy or any other action that's happening at the Capitol. I try to stay involved and make sure that we're in there to see what level of transparency that is. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So many of your listeners right now, or those of us seeing us through live stream, will recall that earlier in the week, I believe it was on Monday, there was a huge announcement from the state capitol. And that announcement with regards to COVID relief was that there was a package of, I think it's $216.5 million that went out, right, in response to the narrative, in response to the outcry from community, right? Community needed help, you know, with jobs. Those of us that have small businesses, right? You know, how are we going to survive? Rental moratoriums, you know, rent is due. Unemployment insurance is set to expire, I think, on the 26th or so. So the legislative body, the House and the Senate, got together, and this bill was their response, right? I'm going to go into more details about what those components are. But our role in that process was to be that of watchdog. Unfortunately, this is the thing. Most of that negotiation happened behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another layer to this COVID pandemic situation that folks don't really give thought to. So $216 million didn't come from the air. It came from our pockets.
Okay.
So we're not talking about money that we are receiving benevolently by some kind of money-making machine in Washington, D.C., or even here in Minnesota, right? We're talking about those of us, whether we're documented or not.
Mm-hmm.
The money that's taken out of our paychecks,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're documented or not. I get this a lot. Well, undocumented people get money, cash. Okay. But the last time I checked, you can't go to Target, you can't pay your utility bills, and you can't mobilize, get gasoline without paying the taxes that are in that.
That's right.
And that's not, I can't go to a pump and be like, oh, where's the option for I'm undocumented, I don't pay taxes. So let's just clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
This is our money. So there are people in these spaces of power that are making decisions about who to give our money to. So my question is, we know that there were lobbyists. I'm going to tell you there were lobbyists there advocating, talking to these politicians about we need, this industry needs, restaurants need, breweries need, this other place need. So my question is, well, who was lobbying for everyday Minnesotans,
Mm-hmm.
for the East Side, for the West Side, for Minneapolis? Who was in there? And that's what we try to do. We try to get in there and figure that out. I had a really tough time. As a matter of fact, under COVID, I get what you can get, Al,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I have to Google.
Mm-hmm.
I can't get a hold of folks all the time because they don't return calls or they don't
Mm-hmm.
return emails.
Mm-hmm.
So I ask myself, if I'm having these issues, how are Minnesotans whose $216 million just got divvied out, how were they heard?
Mm-hmm. Important question. So, here's an Al McFarlane statement that is bouncing around. I've often said, and I say, they get the money, we get the misery. In this equation of problem solving, our communities too often get pushed to the margin being limited to be a problem that is admired and exploited. And the exploiters of us as problem are the power structure, and I'll be more plain, white people. And so white people get the money to solve the problem. We get the honor of being the problem without compensation. And they expect us to, you use the word benevolence, to consider their benevolence, but really it's our money. And the question is, when and how do we get our money to bring our solutions forward? And until we are part of that solution side of the equation, the problems are not going to be solved. That's what I believe. What do you think?
We just had one of the most contentious election cycles, Al. And I don't think that it's a misinformed statement for me to say that BIPOC communities of colors turn out at historic numbers,
Mm-hmm.
really made a difference in one core message that I hope power brokers, and when I say power brokers, I mean all elected officials, BIPOC or not,
Mm-hmm.
at the local all the way through in Minnesota,
Mm-hmm.
congressional level.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the following. I really truly see, Al, to your observation, that our communities are now truly, think about this, Al. When you remove everything from community,
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. Housing, food, medical, that's what the pandemic has done. It has really tore that Band-Aid, right, from our communities of color. And when you take everything from someone, guess what? They ain't got nothing else to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you start rebirthing that innate, inherent, organic power that we have as human beings God created to say enough. And that's what you saw at the core of the George Floyd protests that came out. And people who don't know what it's like to be hungry didn't understand, like, well, why are you doing this, and why are you doing that, and why aren't you going through the channels, right, to mobilize and operationalize change, right? But it's like that young lady who did the Monopoly video. I really hope, Al, anyone that's watching our stream right now and are hearing us, please Google that young lady. Look, just Google and go Monopoly game in quotes and George Floyd. And it's going to auto-populate. It is one of the most phenomenal statements of, Black experience in this North American country that I have yet to be heard. And she really hits the nail on the head to what you said. Part of what I try to do in my role is to move from this idea of transactional engagement with communities of color towards a relational, long-term shared vision of what that means, except that I don't go for the, as you mentioned, white benevolent model to that. I don't enter spaces and say, I'm here to save you. I try to enter spaces to say, I'm here as a tool. What do you need from me to find your voice? Our folks don't need gatekeepers. They have inherent power. They know how to navigate these spaces, but we need to help them, partner with them, right? To make sure that someone's got their front, their back, and their sides as they're navigating these spaces of power. So like here locally, I want to share this with folks. Out of the 216 million that just went out, if you are a small business owner, I want you to lean in. There's about 114 almost 115 million of that is going to go through counties. So reach out to your counties and ask them. There are going to be grants to eligible struggling businesses and nonprofits. So if you're a nonprofit, if you're a small business owner and you've been struggling, reach out to your counties, okay? I believe that each county is supposed to get the greater of about 200,000 per capita. Well, anyway, that detail is not as important as just letting people know there's about $115 million that are going to be fed through counties. If you're a small business and you need some help, reach out to your counties. There's about, I think, 88 million to businesses that have been at least 30% declined and that provide on-site food, beverages. So I thought of like our small restaurants, some of our folks have the trucks and stuff like that, right? I'm trying to filter some of this information through the lens of what's really the reality in our community. So like in our northeast side area, north side of Minneapolis area, where you see a lot of smaller BIPOC, this is something that they could probably tap into. I think that there's about a 14 million that is going to be for like theaters and multi-purpose convention centers or something like that. I think there's a capacity that has to be met for that of about 1,500. So like if there are minority owned, like especially like wedding planners and small event planners, where we feature some of our BIPOC or non-BIPOC, music shows and things like that. I'm trying to like think of how I've seen small businesses in our communities try to be entrepreneurial and trying to get out there. That's funding that is available through there. There's an extension if you are receiving unemployment and you are one of those people whose unemployment was going to expire. I think it's December the 20. I'm going to look at my note. Oh, the 26th. Your unemployment payments are now going to be extended through April 10th, I believe. And I think the intent with that was to help people get over the hump of the winter so they weren't homeless during the winter times and they were able to.
Is that the $300 per week extension? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a 13-week extension, exactly. And it runs from December the 26th, which is when it was supposed to expire, through April 10th. Now, something that I get folks asking me a lot about is what happens to rent? Is it waived? Is it somehow reduced? No, unfortunately, there's currently an eviction moratorium. So that means that until the state of emergency in the state of Minnesota because of the pandemic is done, people will not be subject to evictions.
Mm-hmm.
The issue there is if you're unemployed, you're not really getting all that much money through this unemployment, really. I mean, folks are not going to be able to meet all of their bills just off of unemployment, because that's just a percentage of what, is being contributed. And the concern then becomes, well, what's going to happen on April? I'm just making this up. What's going to happen on April 10th, given that the vaccinations are out and that, this situation and circumstance in Minnesota about, do we still meet the criteria for an emergency, a peacetime emergency or not? What happens if on April 11th, we no longer have that moratorium? Well, what's going to happen legally at this time is that landlords will be able, and trust me, they will. And it's not that they're hateful people. It's that their mortgages have been due all this time too.
Right.
People that have apartment buildings and so forth, they have a mortgage too.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order for them to show good faith, they're going to have to bring those eviction notices, right? And so what does that mean for our communities of color here in the state of Minnesota? What kind of crises is that going to create? What about our kids? People talk about COVID, emotional impact on mental health and so forth. What is this going to mean for our communities of color? And where is that being reflected at the Capitol? Where is that, where is that discussion taking place within the city of Minneapolis, within Ramsey County, within the city of St. Paul? And more importantly, what can we do to make sure that these discussions are in fact taking place?
Well, that's a good point. Anastasia, how do you rate Minnesota's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? I rate it fairly highly. I think a lot of things are being done that haven't been done in the past. Does that mean enough is being done? It does not. I think more needs to be done, but I want to acknowledge the states leaning into and acknowledging that part of the problems that have surfaced in the COVID-19 pandemic and also in the pandemic of 1619, George Floyd response pandemic, what's resurfacing in all of that is clarity on systemic discrimination and disadvantage, institutional structures that disadvantage Black people in particular, people of color in general. And so I think the state is talking the right talk, and it's making some moves to do things properly. The question is it enough, number one? And what will happen once we're past the pandemic? Will things go back to what they used to be? How do we as communities of color make sure that our voices remain loud, clear, and packed with actions that reflect our interest? What do you think?
So, wow, that's a lot to unpack. So the first thing with regards to whether I think that, government, local and otherwise, has responded sufficiently to the pandemic in our communities of color, I think that depends on who we talk about when we talk about sufficiently. Are we talking about Minnesotans in general who represent, well more than 78 to 80 something percent of the population? Or are we talking about, our communities of color as a whole?
And I'm talking about communities of color as a whole.
Okay. If we're talking about communities of colors as a whole, I will say, and again, not being like a health expert or anything like that, I'm going to qualify my response to in the majority of my response, I want to say that I'm focusing more on those issues of social determinants that impact health, right? And not so much, whether, out of 200 people being seen in Hennepin County's emergency room, how many percent of that are people of color and whether they were treated well. I will say that in general, I think our frontline healthcare people are, my God, mobilizing and organizing. And I say that from a personal experience because my son very recently was diagnosed with COVID.
Mm.
And I self-isolated and quarantined. This was something, I say that it came knocking on my door, and I made the error in allowing a family friend to come in who didn't know at the time, and then literally the day after was notified that she had been exposed to COVID. Wow. And then my son tested. Oh. So needless to say, having personally been in the emergency rooms in regions, I think that our frontline people are doing the best that they can. I think that much like in Washington, D.C., our local elected officials have waited to to last minutes of things, right after communities have suffered the consequences, as if we had the luxury of suffering through those consequences. And that's why I want to limit my response now to the social determinants of how communities of color have been impacted disparately in the state of Minnesota. I think that's a given. All it takes is a quick Google to see what I mean by that, right? And so one of the first things I remembered in a recent CDC report, they actually listed discrimination as the first in the list of those social determinants as negatively impacting communities of color in general. Because what the pandemic has done is simply taken a highlighter, just like this one, and highlighted particularly those members within our communities of color that have those essential worker roles. So let's think about those essential worker roles are normally minimum wage paying jobs or agricultural jobs or meatpacking plant jobs, right? And so when you look at those individuals already, we're talking about individuals that have inequities in accessing healthcare, right? Right now, my son's follow-ups are all during, through internet. Well, that assumes I have internet. It assumes I can afford to pay internet. So what about our communities that are those members of those communities that are already at high risk that don't have internet? And even if they could access internet, they can't afford internet, right? And then we talk about educational income and wealth gaps. That's another layer to that, right? What do we mean by that? Well, those individuals that I just mentioned to you are not going to be the folks like me that have the law degrees. These are not going to be the people, I would even say, that have high school, right, degrees. And so by definition, the best they can do to mobilize economically for their families is to have 2 or 3 jobs that are low paying minimum wage jobs, right? And then you have housing. You have crowded conditions. Some families have had to consolidate. So I may have an aunt here, and now in my 2-bedroom, I've got my aunt and myself. And so the whole social distancing when one of us gets sick is impossible. Right. That's another layer. Homelessness. Folks living in their cars right now off of Lake and Bloomington. These are all layers of things. So this is my question. How many of our elected officials, be it Speaker Hortman or Ryan Winkler or Paul Gazelka or Susan Kent, or the mayors or city council leaders or county, how many of them have actually walked up and down Lake Street, not their staff, them, to see firsthand what waiting a week does to people, right? And then right before the elections, you politicize all of this. Help us flip this and this will happen. So what? If that doesn't happen, then what happens? This is what happens. Well, you didn't help us flip this chamber, so you're going to have to sit down and wait for us to flip that chamber in order to get work done. What people forget is that we have lived in a political reality here in Minnesota, COVID or not, pandemic or not, where the House, the Senate, and the governor's office has been under one party. And yet here we are today, still having the same conversations. Why is that? Because the solution is not political banners in any of these spaces of power. The solution is us taking back our democracy, just like we turned out at the polling places in November. right? Now we have to use the same energy and hold those people accountable. I don't care if it's Senator Torres Rey, who I adore. I don't care if it's Senator Melissa Franson, who I adore. I don't care if it's Carlos Mariani, who I adore. I don't care if it's Bobby Joe Champion, who I adore. I don't care. And I can name Republicans who I adore.
All good friends of mine. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right? It's holding power accountable and having them tell us, well, the Republicans wouldn't let us do this. Or the Republicans telling us, well, the Democrats wouldn't let us do that, is the biggest lie ever told you. That's a lie. Your next question should be, okay, what did you do to walk around that? What did you do to reach the ones that would ally with you? What did you do? Or did you just sit back and say, well, my caucus leadership said I had to do this? And see the terms that I'm using, Al, see the dynamics that I'm talking to you about, Al. Where are we educating our community on these things so they can own that space? So the next time one of these legislators or one of these city council people come knocking on the door, they can speak from a place of knowledge and power and say, you know what? I happen to know how that system works, right? We're not doing that. That's the space I'm trying to get Common Cause into. I'm trying to get Common Cause into a space where we are teaching our people, what does this political power look like from a collective perspective? We're about to set our voting maps for the next 10 years.
Yep.
What does that mean for communities of color?
That's extra important now because part of the challenge is division within our communities, particularly Black and Brown. The stats in North Minneapolis, I don't have them, but I know that an interview I did a couple of days ago talked about the greater incidence of COVID infections in North Minneapolis, and that the greater number consists of Black and Brown, African Americans and Latino populations. And in both areas, both infection, hospitalization, and deaths are higher. And I think that story is true around the country. At the same time, there's often systems or processes that try to pit these communities in a competitive mode against each other to suggest that if one gets resources, the other is losing. I think that's not true. But how do we get beyond that? What do you think? And let's do this, if you don't mind. De vez en cuando me gusta usar español en estas conversaciones. Y si puede, si quiere, favor de contestar en español y también tradúzcalo en inglés.
Definitivamente. Definitely. Al, despite some of the challenges that I've just highlighted to you, it's not something that we can't fix. And it's not something that we need to wait, 2, 5, 10 years to do. So, no importa las barreras que yo acabé de describir sobre de qué nos imponen en poder tener más igualdad en la manera que se reparten estos recursos. Lo importante es que podemos resolucionar esas barreras y romper esas barreras ahora mismito, no tenemos que esperar mucho tiempo. So what do I mean when I say that it's something that we can change and do today? The first step is for people to make a commitment to be in relationship with their elected official. No matter if they're Democrat or a Republican. Okay? Because they're representing you. The vote is separate from the representation. Okay? The vote is us hiring that person to be our voice in that space. So, la manera que podemos hacer eso en el inmediato es aprender cómo tener una comunicación fija con los políticos que nos representan. ¿Verdad? No importa si nosotros votamos por esa persona o no. No importa si son demócratas o republicanos, ¿verdad? Porque las dos cosas son diferentes. El voto es nosotros dándole el apoyo político a esa persona que nos representen a nosotros, ¿verdad? Y la representación es algo separado. Right? Okay. So, one is find out who represents you at the city level, at the county level, right? And at the state level. Make a list of those people and get to know them. Find them on Facebook. They're all on Facebook. I assure you, they're at least 90%, 80 to 90% of the people that are representing you. You know why? Because they're people. They're people before they're representative this or senator that. Find them on Facebook. Make it a point to reach out to them just to get to know who they are as a person, right? Just like you would any other friend. You want to become comfortable. You want to get a sense of what things do you see that you two have in common. So, una de las cosas que puedes utilizar para aprender más de quién te representa a un nivel de la ciudad, a un nivel del municipio y a un nivel estatal es a través de Facebook, ¿verdad? Muchos de estos individuos tienen una presencia en las redes sociales como Facebook. Empieza a aprender cosas son los gustos de la persona, ¿qué es lo que a ellos les interesa? Empieza a aprender de esa persona como si fuera un amigo o una amiga para ver qué son los valores que tienen en común y no. ¿Por qué? Eso va a ser clave en la manera que tú vas a comunicar con esa persona. So the reason why go ahead.
Y debes saber que it's not about them, but it's about you.
Exacto.
Y su poder. Y
exacto.
Debe ser ser confiante, debe tener confianza en su poder.
Sí. Exacto. Right, Al. So exactly, that's why you want to do it. You want to do it because ultimately they represent you. And ultimately you need to create that sense of trust, right? With your elected. And you don't have to be besties, but check this out. While the cat's away, the mice will play. Right? And if they see that their constituents are engaging them on social media, if they get those emails and that phone call once in a while on a particular thing that person cares about, like affordable housing or, subsidized funding for free and reduced lunches in the schools or daycare. I mean, whatever the situation is, right? That all of us care about something, right? If we can care about whether we have a damn iPhone or some kind of Android, I think that we can say that it's safe that we also care about other things outside of whatever gadgets we have, right? So es importante nosotros tener ese tipo de interacción porque así como nosotros nos enfocamos en qué tipo de celular, qué modelo, qué son las cositas que traen extra que el otro no, debemos de también tener ese tipo de entendimiento sobre de nuestros representantes, ¿verdad? Porque si nosotros queremos que ellos hagan una cosa como, adquirir más fondos para los lunches que son gratis para los estudiantes o en precio reducido, ¿verdad? Son cosas que queremos esa confianza y esa familiarización. Now I got a tongue twister. Being familiarized, right? With the rep, con ese representante para que ellos puedan ser nuestra voz. Lo que pasa es que nosotros votamos y we check out.
Talk about demographics, how our society, our community in Minnesota and in the nation are changing. And the change in demographics also suggests the capacity to shift out of nationalist modes for our communities, because our communities are not only those of us in families who are here in neighborhoods or in our house, but our families include people who are back at home. Back at home could be in San Juan or Lima, it could be in Saigon, or it could be in, somewhere like Mogadishu, or Accra. And so to have us see ourselves connected globally and that global connection be real, because in most cases, our home countries are recipients of direct financial deposits. We send money back to parents, grandparents, cousins, uncles. We have properties that we support and family we support. So there is a commercial connection already that suggests that our view of the world is not just limited to the specific geography, but it includes that geography, but it's inclusive of a bigger picture, an integration of the whole world. What do you think about that? ¿Qué piensas?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Al, on that perspective. I think that that's a whole nother layer
Mhm.
that falls on the ignorance of many at the Capitol when policy decisions are being made that have an impact on communities of color in Minnesota. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If you get the Capitol full of some of these lobby groups from firms that do nothing but like estates planning, wills and things like
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
they're there to represent their clients' investment needs into what? Their wealth of their family, right?
Mhm.
And so in North America, you're used to that paradigm, right? Oh, yeah, a will. Yeah, I suppose I should do a trust.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, right. But communities of colors wealth structure is more representative of what you've just laid out.
Mhm.
So we invest in our families back home. Sometimes we're supporting our families' small businesses at home,
Mhm.
and those small businesses may look like that little carrito that you push with the ice creams in it, or that little hot dog cart, or the
Mhm.
verdura cart, these roots, vegetables carts that we have in Puerto Rico. Or it could be a little chinchorro. We call them chinchorros in Puerto Rico, which is kind of like those. Here they're like super fancy trucks,
Mhm.
that have the foods. In Puerto Rico, not so fancy, but there's but they feature all kinds of authentic stuff. So some of us are the affordable healthcare access for our
Right.
families down there, and
Right.
that's what our wealth looks like, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So what is being reflected in some of these tax laws that are going through, and what we're allowed to deduct or not deduct, and what is being reflected in our laws coming out of the Capitol or in City Hall or in the county level, right? That impact us in a way that limits our ability to invest in our families and invest in that. And it could be something as easy or as simple as, and I don't want to start all kinds of controversy, but this is something that hit me, for example, here at home.
Mhm.
I had a fabulous family that did my disposal of garbage and recycling
Mhm.
for years. I had that contract with them.
Mhm.
I supported small business because I love to do that. Well,
Mhm.
then comes the city of Maplewood and decides, well, we're going to get rid of that and give it to the big, I can't even recycle, I think is the name of the company.
Right.
Company. White led, not a small family, not a small business, not a BIPOC business.
Mhm.
And I suddenly paid, I think like $10 or $15 more,
Mhm.
right? Oh, wait, and then it gets better. And then that company, Waste Management, that's what it was. And then that company subcontracts. And I'm left like, okay, so hang on a second. So I couldn't continue supporting this small BIPOC owner of this small refuse company, right? Because it had to go to this white owned company contractor who then turns around and, for lack of a better word, okay, I can't say that in the air, is unfair. Let's just say that,
Right.
right?
Right.
In the way they subcontract out.
Mhm.
So these racist types of systems that are put in place specifically because they
Mhm.
know. Come on, I was in procurement at MnDOT.
Mhm.
I know how procurement works.
Mhm.
They know the impacts on the communities that these types of policies and these types of things are going to have. However, what did I just say? While the cat's away, the mice will play.
Uh-huh.
So where are we in these spaces of power? How do we navigate these spaces of power? And I go back to your question of what can we do? Al,
Mhm.
we need to be in relationship, just like we tag each other on Facebook and do the selfies and do all that stuff. It takes us what, 30 seconds to 1 minute. We need to outwit and outsmart. We need to figure out how do we use these social media things that we have, tools, be it Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And we need to use those to directly connect with these elected officials so that they understand, oh, wait a minute. You mean these
Mhm.
folks are watching, right?
Mhm.
And you're
Mhm.
going to see how they shift the paradigms, because I have been in hearings at the Capitol where I have seen Democrats
Mhm.
and Republicans sit there and say, well, where's community? If community cared, they'd be here.
Right.
And that's just crap. They just
Not
use
true.
that as a way
They
of
know it.
justifying.
Yeah. Yeah. They know it.
Because
Listen,
community is working.
this is a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I am so glad to connect with you again. I think this is a rich conversation. The takeaway is really instruction on what we can do.
Exactly.
And what we can do is take back our power, trust ourselves, represent our interest, and do that with a fierceness and a confidence that as we voice our vision for what community is, we are doing this in a spirit that really helps everybody. Our description of winning is not a description that you have to lose. It's more of a description that we can all win, but you have to get off of whatever it is that keeps you in a scarcity mindset where you feel you have to guard against me to maintain what you have, which is not true. So that's what I think we're talking about. And I appreciate and applaud you at Common Cause, the work that you're doing. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Al. I really enjoyed it. My only thing is that you have the power. You're sitting on it right now.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it right now.
Mm-hmm.
Get to know your elected officials and communicate with them, tag them, find them, ask to be joined on their Facebook page. Do the same research you do to figure out which cell phone you want. Do the same thing with your elected officials. Figure out, research it, look them up. Ask them, what are you going to move to help me have a better quality of life here in my neighborhood, on my block?
Mm-hmm. There we go. Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota. Thank you so very much. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you all.